Boktai 2, The Solar Boy Django. This is a game that every single year I say I'm going to talk about, and I never once do. Well, that changes today. This is a game that is a sequel to a game called Boktai, The Sun is in Your Hand, a game I talked about 10 years ago. It was one of my earliest videos, and it's still one of my most all-time favorite Game Boy games. And I find it utterly baffling that this game, and by extension its series, is kind of entirely an unknown. Like, say what you will about how its mechanics might appeal to people, I totally get how off-putting they would be, but you have to understand, this was a game by Hideo Kojima, and it's probably his most innovative and creative game he's ever made. And it's not bogged down by the terrible trappings of his inability to write, because fortunately, he only actually produced this game, which means it's going to be an infinitely better game for it. And yes, I am still bitter about that half-hour-long playable cutscene in MGS4 where I spent it running up and down the stairs as a tiny robot, because it was the only thing preventing me from dying from boredom. And that terrible 4-hour ending cutscene from that game. But speaking of, another point that should make this game far better known, this game cameoed in Metal Gear Solid 4. Although I'm guessing everyone that would care died of boredom from all those cutscenes, who knows. But if that wasn't enough clout to actually make this game known anywhere, it had a very sizable contribution in no less than 3 separate Mega Man games. Yeah! How the bloody hell is Boktai so obscure? I still don't understand this. Well, once again, I'm going to contribute to making that less of a thing. Now, Boktai 2 kind of continues off where Boktai 1 left off. Django has succeeded in getting revenge for his father's death over the Count of Ground-Soaking Blood and has defeated the Queen of the Immortals, Hell, and is on his way back home to the City of Sunlight, San Miguel. Except now it's more like the City of Death, and he might have some work to do, but surprise vampire! And surprise vampire happens to steal his gun. This could be really bad, but don't worry, because only people with the very specific Solar Boy blood can use— oh, he just got shot by his own gun. Huh. That might be a problem. So surprise vampire wanders off with Django's gun, leaving the Solar Boy completely disarmed. Now lacking the weapon that has given him his title and his defining purpose as the Solar Boy, yeah, he can't purify vampires or do his job. This could be a problem. And you won't see that weapon again for most of the game. You might want to remember that because I'm going to be upset about this later. Either way, Django meets the random sunflower girl who is some kind of fortune teller who hands him the soul device, which is some kind of gauntlet that can just imbue things with the power of sunlight because he has sunlight magic and the solar sensor, so that's fine. And it can later be modified using the solar gun's various lenses that I guess got ripped off somehow. I'm not sure how the bespoke lenses of that very one-of-a-kind weapon somehow got removed and then turned into gauntlet power-ups, but yeah. So now he's back in business, able to solar power any weapon he picks up. And by that, I mean 3. Awesome. Now Django must set out to destroy all of the immortals and bring sunlight back to San Miguel. Preferably while recovering his weapon, figuring out what the hell that weird vampire guy that stole its whole deal is, and ultimately saving the world from undeadification. But fortunately, he's not alone. He has his master, the Spirit of Sunlight Otenko, this talking sunflower guy who's mostly useless and there for exposition. And heck, he may even run into his bro. Just have a nice little family reunion here in the City of Death. And hey, the villagers that Django may save might just play a part in ultimately saving the world, but more accurately, they're just gonna stand around in town like lemons. And ultimately, it's Django and Master Otenko's duty to ensure that for the world, the sun will rise tomorrow. The story itself is pretty succinct, which is surprising considering this is a Kojima game, but I definitely appreciate that there aren't 4-hour-long cutscenes you have to sit through to actually get what's going on in the plot, and then realize that you fell asleep halfway through, so hopefully you get it. No, this one's actually pretty straightforward and simple. Solar Boy got his solar gun taken away, he's no longer Solar Boy, he's Gauntlet Boy, and now Gauntlet Boy needs to get it back, and also defeat all the evil ever. Simple. Now the gameplay to Boktai 2 is very similar to the first game in a lot of respects. It's an isometric stealth game slash shooter, sort of. You run around environments trying to sneak past enemies when you can, kill them when you can't, and you try and get through individual dungeons to ultimately work towards your goal of vanquishing all the evil in the land. It's pretty simple conceptually, but it is actually a pretty complicated game. Gauntlet Boy has to go outside and try and fight these vampires using his new magic gauntlet and whatever weapon he can apply energy through it to. He can run around, he can flatten himself up against walls and sidle around, knock on walls to create an audio distraction to lure enemies in to attack them from behind or to sneak past. He has the ability to attack with no less than 4 different weapons, although honestly they're not that interesting, especially compared to the first game, but we'll get there in a minute. And thanks to the power of the soul device, he can actually infuse his elements and solar magic into all of his weapons so that they're more effective. So you're no longer just hitting a zombie with a sword, you're hitting them with a sword fueled by sunlight that will actively burn them from the inside, and this is really cool, but you have to be careful. Just because Gauntlet Boy is no longer using a solar gun, Django's abilities are powered by the sunlight, so he's got to be outside to use them. And the sun, while its power is very much infinite, you know, in our small cosmic speck of a lifetime as human beings anyway, for Gauntlet Boy as a vampire hunter, the sunlight can be very painfully finite, and you become very aware of this. If you ever go indoors, you'll be desperately looking for windows and skylights to power yourself up. If you're outside, well, if it's raining or you're in the shade, you're kinda screwed. He has a solar sensor equipped to him that allows him to store all the energy he can ever use into his solar gun, which has somehow been modified for his gauntlet. Don't worry about it. So as long as he's outside, he should be able to gather energy from the sun. Should he ever need energy, all he needs to do is stand out in the sun, hold his solar sensor aloft, and yell, "Tayo!" and he'll be powered up to allow you to continue to infuse objects with your magic to do absurd amounts of damage because everything's undead and weak to sunlight. Unless we're talking golems or mummies, everything has an elemental weakness, but it's cool. But of course, this is a Hideo Kojima game. It's gotta be innovative, it's gotta be interesting, it's gotta be creative, right? Well, yeah. Boktai 2, much like Boktai 1, came in a clear cart. That clear cart had a small little black square in it. That little black square, that's a solar sensor. In order to give Django energy, he not only needs to be outside, not in the rain or shade, but you have to be able to hit that solar sensor on your Game Boy Advance cartridge with sunlight. And yes, you do have to hold your Game Boy Advance, or in my case GameCube, towards the sky and yell "Tayo!" because that's how the auteur designed it, and that's immersion, damn it. And the sun is absolutely necessary in some levels, such as, like, when you're trying to finally purify the boss's souls, if you don't have sufficient enough sunlight, you can't actually start. Now, this is actually great if you're, like, in Norway or Finland, where the sun never sets for, like, 3 months. But counterpoint, those places also have, like, 24-hour darkness during other periods of the year. So, in the latter instance, plan your gameplay accordingly, because you won't be fighting bosses for months. Sorry. But basically, depending on how much sun hits the solar sensor, you will actively charge your weapons, as well as modifying the environment around you, because there's a lot that's actively affected by the solar sensor. Certain panels will appear or disappear or get powered by it. In fact, you can create traps by making solar panels appear, have enemies walk on them, and then drop them into pits. That's a fun little trick for some instant kills. But the sun isn't always your friend. The more sun that hits your solar sensor, the more the food in your backpack spoils, because the heat's actually making it rot. So you have to use your solar sensor tactically. And I do appreciate just how much it's actively encouraging these unique mechanics, while at the same time saying, look, we need this, and we did kind of focus everything around this. It's a little gimmicky, we're sorry, but don't go crazy with it. In fact, you can't go crazy with it because there's an over limit timer. If you get too much sunlight and too much heat on this, I guess to prevent the cartridge from melting, Django will start catching fire and the game will prevent you from absorbing any more sunlight until the cartridge cools off, which is a neat little feature. So let's start with the dungeons themselves, because Django is going to be going through 2 different types of dungeons through the course of your game. You'll have standard dungeons, which are small little interstitial areas, usually having a small reward at the end, and usually some villager that panicked in the chaos of the city turning evil or whatever that you need to go rescue. You'll usually try and avoid enemies as much as you can, although you can go Rambo and kill them all if you want and you have the ammo for it. You'll usually have to go through 1 or 2 puzzles, most of which are fairly simple, although there are a few that are a little confusing. The first dungeon I went through had a room that just said, hit switches 3, 5, and 7, but there were only 3 switches. I saw a little, like, graffiti outside that was like the number 7, so I was like, okay, so that's number 7. No, that's not it. It actually referred to the number of enemies in each room. This game can be a little esoteric with its hints and what it wants you to do at times with its puzzle designs, but for the most part it's pretty straightforward. When you get past all of that, you are then presented with a trap room. This is sort of like the final combat challenge of each area, and it's usually fight a mini boss or a group of small bosses where you finally get a small reward and the villager you were looking for. In the bigger immortal dungeons, these are the actual proper dungeons in the game, and these are a lot more complicated, and not just because they are substantially bigger. That is the case, but they have a lot more puzzles around them as well, and tend to introduce more mechanics and unique puzzles. You start by traversing each layer, once again trying to avoid enemies as much as possible and solving puzzles where they occur, and ultimately build your way towards the final area where you fight the immortal vampire or is in control of the area. Here, you actually get a proper boss fight, and these can be very protracted and usually have some fun mechanics associated with them that are usually unique to the boss fight themselves. They're not terribly complicated or difficult, but they're interesting certainly. If you manage to defeat the boss, that's when the challenge actually begins, because I hope you were making note of that stealth route you were taking through the dungeon, because now you need it more than ever. If you decided to play John Rambo up to this point and kill everything because you somehow miraculously had the energy to do it, well, now you kinda can't. Instead, you have to take a slower, stealthier, more conscientious and meticulous route through the dungeon in reverse. Except this time, well, that boss you just killed, well, it's trapped in a coffin, and you have to lug it all the way back to town without being seen by enemies because they'll attack you if you have it. And you're very slow and held down, and yeah, sure, you can certainly drop the coffin and try and attack enemies, but the occupant of said coffin won't be having any of it, and they'll try crawling back to their lair. And if they do, well, every room respawns all its enemies, so you'll have to do each room over. It's really more sensible to try and play every stage in reverse of how you got here, which is why it's not necessarily the best plan ever to try and just go in guns blazing. You certainly can, but the game does force you to stop and take a more thoughtful route back, and really, on your way through, make conscious notes of all the different areas you've been to, the way you went through them, the enemy spawn rates, and their patterns to try and trick them. And every enemy, of course, has different things that they'll notice, such as mummies being blind, but very sensitive to sound, whereas other enemies are entirely visual based. You can trick them or lead them different ways to modify their route so you can get a better route through where you need to go, but these are all things you need to make note of on your way up, because on your way down, that's when things actually get hard. If you actually manage to get out of all that and drag this coffin all the way back to town, you then start the purification process, where you activate the pile driver, and just before you actually get into the boss fight, it makes the most obnoxious sound ever, and if you're audio sensitive like me, it might cause you to panic a lot, because seriously, it is a very obnoxious blaring alarm and I hate it. But then you actually get to a boss fight where you then have to fight a stationary coffin and the spirit inside, while purifying it with laser death beams of sunlight. This is what it's all about, people. Purification of evil using death lasers of light and goodness. Boktai. Now, before we continue, I think I have to talk about one of the weirder things about this game, and I think it's a negative, certainly, and that is, this game has a really weird pacing to it. Like, I can't prove it in any real way, but it just feels like it to me that this game had probably 3 more chapters that got cut somewhere along the way, and all of their content got dumped into the existing game. And I say that because, as much as I don't want to compare games, I'm going to probably end up doing that a whole lot here. In the original Boktai, you went through several main dungeons and you got different elemental abilities for your gun. A different lens that allows you to shoot fire instead of sunlight, or ice, or cloud property, whatever that actually is. And these were used to activate different puzzles and things. And as you went along, you used it more and more, and you learned to use them in conjunction with one another to do more complicated tasks. This game kind of starts out like that. Like, in the tutorial, you get your sunlight power back, and then in the first dungeon, you get fire power. Debatably, you get 2 weapons, but I don't think they changed the game enough to really warrant too much of a mechanical change, so that's fine. But in the second full dungeon, here's where things get really mechanically cramped for some reason. Very early on, you get your 3rd elemental ability, Ice, which you're going to need very, very quickly. And then a few rooms later, you get another element, Cloud, for some reason. And then they start, like, immediately telling you to start using all these powers in conjunction with one another, with various blocks that change their properties depending on what element you hit them with. So, like, you don't really have time to get used to either of these 2 new properties before the game says, great, now use everything you've learned all at once with this new thing we've just introduced, which does not give the player enough breathing room to really get used to the weapons he's got. I certainly didn't feel that way. And that's not where this ends, because it ends on a boss fight with some completely unique mechanics that requires you to play defensively for once, which is definitely different. I found that fight to be a little bit frustrating, but certainly not impossible. But then once you finish that boss fight, you're given reins over a completely new character who has a completely different moveset. And now you might be thinking, well, now you've got time to at least learn this new character before having to go back and relearn all the abilities that just got dumped onto you because this character doesn't have them. No! Because you're on a time limit, and if you don't go fast enough through basically reversing the dungeon to sort of purify the boss of that dungeon, sort of, kind of, not really, you die. So you have to do that, and you have to do that while your health is constantly draining and while your target time is constantly ticking down. You have no time to actually get used to this new moveset that you've learned, and then if you actually manage to complete that little task, you're given a completely new character that not only has all of Django's old stuff, recontextualizes his old stuff, removes a few of his old things, and then gives him a whole swag of new abilities. Like, it just feels like this was 3 chapters worth of content that they just kind of smushed into one because they ran out of time or cartridge space or something, but it just feels like they introduced way too much in way too small a period of time. It was just such a weird pacing issue. And it sucks because I actually really like some of the mechanics this introduces, like the final character that recontextualizes some of Django's older stuff. That's really genuinely interesting, and I had a lot of fun with that. I just wish there was a bit more of a build-up instead of we're just gonna keep throwing mechanics at you over and over and over, so hopefully you can keep up, because it feels a little bit rushed and not in a way where the player's really going to be able to really internalize the smaller details of every important mechanic that they're taught. And while we're on a roll with talking about things I don't necessarily like in terms of how the game was changed from the first game, this is the one big thing that really makes me think this game is inferior to the original, and that is the way weapons are designed. So in this game, you have 3 weapons. Okay, 4 if you count your bare hands, but you're fighting zombies. You don't want to be bit. Don't do that. You have a sword, which attacks in a nice little arcing attack. You have a hammer, which is used to smash blocks, and that's about it because it's too slow to actually hit anything. And you have a spear, which gives you a little bit of range, but a tiny hitbox, and it's very, very stiff to use, so I wouldn't bother using it. But it's just that. You have 3 weapons. You can get other variations of these weapons, but they all behave identically. They just have smaller effects or, do more damage, and that's it. Still, 3 weapons. In the original Boktai, you had 1 weapon, which initially sounds like a downgrade, right? Well, not really. Because while in Boktai 2 you have 3 weapons that all effectively do more or less the same thing, which is, physical damage plus whatever element you apply to them, albeit in a slightly more specific way. In Boktai 1, you had 1 weapon, the Gun del Sol, but it had infinite potential because it was designed modularly. The way you get to play with the Gun del Sol in Boktai 2 is sort of like its default state in Boktai 1. You get to shoot a little ball of energy, that's your lot. But in Boktai, you could modify its lens, which gave it a different elemental property, not unlike the Soul device in Boktai 2. But then you could change its battery to allow it to hold more sunlight energy to continue to power it. And you could actually charge multiple ones at once to have backup batteries, which was really, really cool. You could get a different grenade launcher to change the way it shot grenades and stuff. And most importantly, you got a different frame, which completely changes how it attacks. So your little individual shots, well, suddenly it's a spread. Suddenly it's a spinny tornado thing. Suddenly it's a sword. The Gun del Sol was 1 weapon, but it was 1 weapon that it could handle any problem and give you an unlimited number of solutions, but it was tailor-made for you customizing it and figuring out the best way to use it for your own playstyle and become the ultimate Solar Boy. Unfortunately, Gauntlet Boy doesn't have that ability, and honestly, I feel like that's a huge loss. And it's not just because that has a huge effect on combat, it has a huge knock-on effect in traversal and exploration and basically everything. Because in Boktai 1, when you went into dungeons, frequently when you got past the trap little boss areas for the smaller dungeons, you would get a reward that was a piece of your solar gun. And then you were encouraged to go around testing it out and seeing if you like this and what it might be useful for. It was actively affecting your ability to explore and changing how you might approach the game after that point. In this game, there is no such reward. You go to a dungeon, you save some villagers, and then they just stand around town for a while. That's sort of it. And unless their character's on the critical path, like the guy who works the forge, they don't really do all that much. And you could maybe make the argument, well, look, they'll drop weapons as rewards in this game too, and yeah, sure they'll do that, but every weapon is effectively the same weapon of its type, just with different numbers applied to it, and that's really boring. Because they took away the modular nature and indeed the focus of the weapons themselves from Boktai 1, suddenly they have no decent rewards in this game. There's no reason to really go through any of the other dungeons because you're not really going to get anything as a player out of it. That really hurts any sort of interest in exploring because there's just no treasure or incentive to do it. Ultimately, Boktai is a really cool gothic horror vampire hunting adventure with some really neat, interesting mechanics. Unfortunately, it didn't hit with too many people, and it's a shame because honestly, I think it's a fantastic game. The dungeon crawling is a lot of fun, and the puzzle solving, for the most part, works really well. At one point, you have to go to a room, and there's like a candle you have to light, but there's no way for you to reach it, so oh hey, there's a mummy in the area. Well, if you make some noise, he'll walk over to that flame trap and oh, he just set everything on fire, including the candle, so get out of there. That was a nice little bit of comedy and fun, creative, out-of-the-box thinking for puzzle solving. Some of it is also a little obtuse, but I think the gameplay to Boktai 2 is great. The real sticking point for me is just how much of a downgrade the modular weapon system from the first game had that was completely removed when brought over here. No longer are we the solar gunslinger. Instead, we're just some guy with a gauntlet and a sword, and it just feels very reductive mechanically. The overall presentation to Boktai 2 is absolutely stellar. Visually, it does some absolutely impressive things for the GBA. All of the sprites look great, although there are quite a few that have been taken from the previous Boktai games. A lot of enemies have been reused, of course. But then you've got stuff like Django's alternate form, which recontextualizes, like his abilities, completely different bits of his design, such as his scarf turning into a pair of wings and his goggles turn into like his eyes, and they're just terrifying looking. His redesign for his alternate form is awesome. And then you have like the spirits from the pile driver boss fight sequences, which look absolutely amazing and have a tremendous transparency effect applied to them. The visuals here are absolutely stellar. And audio-wise, this game actually did something quite different from the original Boktai. Instead of leaning into the sort of gloomy horror atmosphere the original did, aurally, this actually goes hard the other way for one of Boktai's other inspirations: spaghetti westerns. All of the songs sound like they would fit perfect in an Old West gunfight that Gauntlet Boy forgot to bring his weapon to. Yeah, I'm still bitter about that. But I have to admit, the soundtrack is absolutely killer and way better than I remember it being, and I might have to use some of the songs. Because seriously, the trap room music alone is too powerful for me not to use in something. Honestly, if I had one thing I would say is substantially better than the first game, the presentation, specifically the music, absolutely knocks it out of the park. Now, if you want a copy of Boktai 2 Gauntlet Boy Django on the GBA, cheapest English copy I see right now is $200! I'm actually not that surprised about it. It was a cult game, and it was a very, very innovative game for its time, but not that many people actually picked up on it or even really know about it, so I imagine it is definitely a collector's item. If you do want to have the Boktai experience on a budget, however, while the original Boktai is about as expensive, honestly, the fourth game in the series, Lunar Nights on the DS, was actually pretty affordable. You know, comparatively, it's about 40 bucks. It's a pretty decent game. It doesn't have the solar sensor nonsense either, so it's a little bit more friendly to the people who don't want to go outside. I mean, it defeats the entire purpose of the series, really, but, you know, it's more approachable, so that's good. I certainly didn't pay anywhere near this much. I bought both of them at a GameStop off their GBA cart shelf for like $5 each back in the day. But while I do love these games, I don't think they're worth anywhere near that much. But the thing is, there's not really another way to play them, at least without modifying the code, because you do need the solar sensor to actually work. So short of modifying a ROM for it, there's not really a lot of ways to be able to play this game. At least not as intended, certainly, which is kind of a shame. But Boktai has always been a series I've been very, very passionate about. Sadly, I still do not have a copy of Boktai 3, the only one we didn't get in North America because the series after 2 games proved untenable, but they went back and released the 4th game on the DS for some reason. Although I hear you can get modified carts on Etsy. Maybe when I actually get some money kicking around, that might be a goal for me. But either way, Boktai 2, I want to recommend this game substantially more than the first game, but the one real sticking point for me is just how much the loss of the modular weapon system really hurts the game mechanically in my eyes. Which sucks because there's so much more going for it, you know? You have your interesting new characters with their new mechanics, and you've got a really genuinely interesting story with some cool backstory. Plus we finally get to see where Django's from and what this whole place is, and more of his backstory. And that's really cool. I love Boktai and Boktai 2, and I've always made it a goal to bring these to people's attentions because of how interesting a game they were, and the fact that no one seemed to play them in spite of the fact that they were also, in Metal Gear Solid 4 and also in 3 different Mega Man games. They're engaging stealth games, fun horror games, and something completely different that you won't find anywhere else. And I mean, it did well enough to get 4 games in the series, so it did something right. And yet, it still feels way too obscure. And that's a shame. I honestly think more people need to know about and more people need to talk about because it was just so different and interesting. It showed what you could do with peripherals on the GBA in an interesting way that wasn't just really badly artifacted movies. Because seriously, those GBA videos are just horrible. This was actually a good use of something different on the GBA and something interesting. And back in the day, it made me quite happy to talk about. Like I said, every year I made a point to try and talk about this game because I wanted more people to know about it because I think it's so interesting. The Boktai series created a very deep impression on me, and I think because of it, I'll always keep the sun in my heart.